Hello everybody, we're coming in for the video for today, and as I mentioned earlier this past weekend, this week is mostly focusing on the 1830s. So today's video will be on basically the political philosophy of Jacksonian democracy. Yes, we are talking politics. I'm not talking about today's politics, I'm talking about politics over 170 some years ago, or more. So this is not today's politics. I understand that talk about today's politics, you're bound to get some very bad judgment on that and some bad people that will argue with you no matter what. But since most of the people that were alive, I'm going to guess that everyone that was alive during Jacksonian democracy during the 1830s probably isn't alive anymore. So we can talk about the philosophy that happened there. Now, Jacksonian democracy was really the product of a certain president, who, of course, it is named after, and that is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was our seventh president of the United States. He was actually the first Democratic president of the Democrat Party, so it was actually his party that he formed. He was a very feisty frontiersman guy, and he was a president that liked to get his way or no way. So the whole era is kind of named after him, but he was immensely popular with the people, and we will explain that here, I guess, right now, supposedly. Jackson was a common man, and so to speak. He wasn't a wealthy guy. He was born in a log cabin in South Carolina during the 1760s. During the Revolutionary War, he had actually served as a courier for the Continental Army and actually had been a prisoner of war as he was arrested and taken as a prisoner by British soldiers. So he was also the last man to become president that had fought in the Revolutionary War. And later on, he became an U.S. Army general, led the American Army to victory at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, which occurred in 1815, and then subsequently became a driving force in national politics, eventually running for president in 1824, losing to John Quincy Adams, who was the son of former President John Adams, and then subsequently running again in 1827, I believe. Let me think here. No, 1828, and then actually winning the presidency that time, and then was consequently reelected. But anyway, Jackson was known as the people's president because he had humble beginnings. He started as a common man. He had not started out like George Washington, or he wasn't a figure like George Washington. He wasn't like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or James Madison. He had been basically a kid at the time of the American Revolution. He was not, well, for most of his life, he was not a wealthy, high-owning politician. He wasn't a slave owner. He was just a common man that had worked his way up through politics, is what he was kind of viewed as. And of course, this drew immense support from the people. Now, this time in American history, during the era of Jacksonian democracy, you had basically the gradual factionalization of political parties. And mostly this became with the Democratic Republican Party. In the 1790s, two political parties had emerged in the country. There was the Federalists, and then there was the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson. Now, the Federalists believed that a strong central government was needed to enforce the laws of the nation and to rule it effectively. The Democratic Republicans thought that the government should limit how much control it has over people's lives and leave it mostly up to the people, that there should be limited government involvement. Now, after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party had kind of dissolved and gone extinct due to the factor that during the war, many Federalists were anti-war, and even in New England especially, they had actually fomented New England to possibly break away from the Union or secede, if you will. And then they came to be viewed as traitors after the war, and the Federalist Party just gradually went extinct by 1820. The Democratic Republican Party thus had no political candidate rival. They had no main political rival, but although the Federalists were gone, they started to break apart on their own due to conflicting views. And what happened was because of President John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, you had two distinct camps that come up, and the Democratic Republican Party splits apart in about 1824, 1825. And you have the Whigs, which come and believe that the United States is basically one whole entity, and that is led mostly by people such as John Quincy Adams. And then you have the Democrats, which are still here today, and they basically were led by Andrew Jackson. Now, the era contained, we call it the era of Jacksonian democracy because it was really the democratization of politics. It was basically, it contained a democratic spirit in the common people, and it pushed through many changes and reforms to the political system in the United States and to other aspects to help the common man. It was basically testing how far could democracy go in America in this new experiment that we had started back in the 1770s. So basically, what Jacksonian democracy, keep in mind, it's a period, but it's also a philosophy. And there were certain principles of this Jacksonian democracy. And of these principles, we have the principles of manifest destiny, which was the belief that the United States had a God-given right or destiny to expand westward to the Pacific Ocean. There was patronage, which was also known as a spoil system, and we'll get to what that is here in a little while. That will be mentioned more in detail here. Expanded suffrage was another thing that often happened for all, but unfortunately, this was mostly only meant to classify for all white men. At the time, voting was constricted to only white men that owned property. It wasn't good enough to just be a white male; you had to own property as well. Well, under Andrew Jackson in his subsequent era of Jacksonian democracy, which actually continued far beyond his presidency, this changed and it became known that any white male in the United States that was an adult could vote. Unfortunately, this still left many out, such as women were still not allowed to vote, and African Americans that were free were not allowed to vote, nor were Native Americans. That kind of hurts that aspect of it. We had a strict constructionism. That's another fundamental principle of Jacksonian democracy, and this basically was the fact that it generally federal a federal government was favored that had limited powers. Since the Democrats had been more on the Democratic Republican viewpoint, they retained kind of some of that same sense, and it was contributed that the government needs to have less power than it has now. There was also the principle of laissez-faire, which is a French term, which it stands to the economy, and laissez-faire essentially means hands-off approach, basically. And what this does is that the government does little, if nothing, to interfere with the economy and should let the economy be on its own. There shouldn't be too much government interference in how the economy handles itself. Thomas Jefferson had actually been a big proponent of this, but it had been a struggle to try to get that into place until Jacksonian democracy came. And there was also opposition to banking, and we will explain what that is. Exactly. It does involve banks. There was a growth in abolition movements, which advocated for the abolishment of slavery, the end of slavery. Although this would not happen during Jacksonian democracy, it would happen within the next 30 or 40 years. And there was the final principle, it was that there was a belief that the wealthy should have to pay more than the lower income common people did. The first kind of instance in American history where people started to get the idea, well, if wealthy people are making more, they need to be paying taxes more. They need to be picking up more of the budget if they can make more, unlike us who are stuck here making less money. And that very much still applies to today. There's still heavy debate over whether or not the rich should be taxed heavier than the common middle class person, or if they should be taxed the same. In my personal opinion, I think that it should be that the rich people who are rich should get taxed a little bit more, because if you're making a heck lot more money, you should be taxed a little bit more for that. That's my opinion. I'm not saying I can make that law, but that is my personal opinion on that matter. Now, as we mentioned, Jackson was seen as a people's president. He was seen as a people's candidate. And in case any of you don't know who Andrew Jackson is, I'm going to give you two things here. I know I mentioned him in the previous video on the Indian removal, which we're also going to mention. Jackson is the president on your $20 bill. It shocks me how many Americans and how many people do not know the presidents on their money unless it's George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. Many of them don't know who is on the nickel. Thomas Jefferson. Many of them don't know who's on the 20. Here's a hint, it's Andrew Jackson who we're talking about. Many of you don't know who's on the dime. That is Franklin Roosevelt. He was president during World War II and the Great Depression. Many of you don't know who is on the $10 bill and the 100. I'm going to give you a very big hint. The $10 bill, I'll actually give you some credit on. The $10 bill is Alexander Hamilton. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington. He was never actually a president. And of the $100 bill, if you don't know, I don't know how you've lived in America and not known this, it's Benjamin Franklin. You need to know that, people. No, he was not a president, but they were influential figures in American history. And the $50 bill is Ulysses S. Grant, who was our 18th president during the 1870s, and Grant had been the top-ranking, top Union Northern commander during the Civil War. So I just wanted to make that clear, people. But anyway, on the $20 bill, if you have one or if you see one, the president on the 20 is Andrew Jackson. That is who we're talking about. And in case you still don't know who I'm talking about, this is him. This is the man that this has devoted, basically comes in, is the first people's president, and he kind of implements all these reforms. This is Andrew Jackson. That's him. So anyway, during the election of 1828, and again, I go off my notebook here, Jackson he had a feisty frontier spirit. He knew how to get you to move by making you think he was angry. Jackson had this feisty frontier spirit, and he did have a temper. He had a temper. He was not afraid to use words. And in fact, Jackson got in a lot of fights prior to being president. He actually got in a fight with a man over someone insulting his wife, who very sadly died just months before he went to the White House. And here's another factor. The rest of his life, Andrew Jackson actually had 2 bullets in his chest from duels that he had with past people, and he had been shot, and they had deemed that the bullets were not life-threatening, and they left him in them. So he walked around with 2 bullets walking around in him. He was a tough guy. Andrew Jackson, of course, due to his feisty frontier spirit and his political views, he was kind of not exactly seen as a great figure, and some people called him a tyrant, some people called him a king. And in fact, during the election of 1828, a certain political opponent of Jackson called him a jack-blank, or a donkey. I don't want to say the full word here, because I don't know what's going to happen if I were to. Plus, I don't really want to say the full word in the first place. But I'm sure you know what I'm meaning when I say jack, or I mean jack, or I say donkey afterward. I think you mean what I'm saying. Well, anyway, Jackson was called this during the campaign. Jackson actually liked the name, and he took the donkey as the symbol of his new political party. And this is actually, in fact, where the Democratic Party today, how we have the donkey and elephant symbols for the Democratic and Republican parties, that is where the Democrats get their donkey as their symbol, is because their first president that was from their party, Andrew Jackson, was once called a donkey, or the other word. But anyway, that's where that symbol comes from. I just thought I'd add that in there. Now, Jackson, of course, is our first common man, and he was mostly Jackson was not elected by the wealthy elite. He was mostly elected by the middle class, lower income people of the nation. He was the first president to really be elected on that kind of a base, and that was historical in its own right. Now, Jackson's Democratic Party reflected this, and it was mostly, at the time, it was a coalition of poor farmers, city laborers, and even Irish Catholic immigrants that were coming over from Ireland due to the potato famine that they were having over there at the time. So that kind of gives a background a little bit here. Now, as for what actually happened during the age of Jacksonian democracy, these are the reforms that really brought it about. There were multiple reforms that took place in this, and it was mostly based on Jackson's political views. Jackson was a common man, and he believed that the wealthy elite, the main principle he tried to find was that he wanted to broaden the influence of the common people and have them have a greater say in their government. He didn't want the wealthy elite having that great amount of power for themselves. He wanted the common people to have just as much of it as anyone else could. And honestly, it's a very good principle to think of. You don't want the power in the hands of a wealthy elite, or else you start to have an oligarchy, which I hate to tell you this, but that is what Russia is right now. Russia may not be the Soviet Union, but they have kind of an oligarchy where a lot of the business and government are controlled by these wealthy elite business leaders. And Vladimir Putin, of course. Yes, Putin, I know you're probably watching this because we know you have spies in this country. So, greetings from America, President Putin. But guess what? I do not like you. And I hope you know that. Anyway, Jackson does a lot of reform during his time in office to try to correct what he sees as a corrupt government full of wealthy elitism. And to try to impose his will in this, he starts doing a lot of things. For instance, to help the poor farmers and planters in the country, he does two big things for them and as president that are, one, very highly controversial, and we mentioned this in a previous video. Was the first thing he does, he backs cheap land prices. He would back the cheaper land prices that were offered. But the big controversial thing he did to try to help these farmers and planters was that he, of course, took a unrelenting policy of Indian removal by removing the Native American peoples, especially in the South and Midwest, off their reservations or off their native lands to new territory west of the Mississippi. As we mentioned that in our previous video, that we know how stunningly well that went. But anyway, that was a very controversial thing, as we mentioned. But it was something that Jackson did, believing it was going to help the poor farmers and planters in the nation. Now, just to add here, Jackson was so popular with the people that at his inauguration, Jackson had an open house kind of inauguration where people could actually come inside the White House to see the president. So many of common people just came in there, not these wealthy, fancy people. These were just common people. They were coming in the White House, muddy boots, trampling on the carpet, just destroying everything. That to get Jackson had to flee out the back door just to get away from the crowd. And to try to get these people back out of the White House, they put a big old tub of punch on the front lawn of the White House just to get all the people out. He was this popular. Now, Jackson, another thing that he did was he created what we call a spoils system. And I mentioned this previously, but I did not explain what it was. And what the spoils system basically is a spoils system. It's a governmental thing. And it clears out opposing officials with people who are loyal to you. Basically, it was the practice of you get elected to a public office, be it senator, state representative, president, governor, and you had all these people who were big campaign supporters. They were loyal to you all along the way. Well, you, in effect, the spoil system, you're rewarding those loyal patrons by, after gaining the office of whatever you were running for, you then install those loyal supporters into important government positions as a reward for their support. Basically rewarding them for whatever they did. The bad side of this is that means you can have just about anybody be in charge of finance. That's not a good idea. You could have a farmer be in charge of a military position and this farmer could have absolutely no idea about how to run the military, but yet he's appointed there because he supported you. It could have its benefits in the fact that you could quickly get rid of any political enemies you may have had in those posts, but on the downside, the person you put in there may not have a lick of sense at all over what they're in charge of. And in fact, the spoils system was kind of a bad thing because as time went on, many political supporters of presidential candidates, when their candidate would actually win the election, they came to just downright expect that they were going to get rewarded with a post. And there would be lines of these people just going to the White House asking to see the president and demand a job. And many of them would do it. And these would be lasting days to weeks or months even long. And unfortunately, it would come to an end in the 1880s because it got so bad that in 1881, a disgruntled worker who had been a supporter of presidential candidate James Garfield, who had then won the election, he could never really get into the White House in these lines to see the president and demand a job. And he felt that the president was ignoring him. And of course, I don't know if anyone else might remember this. Not that you'd remember it, but you should know it. James A. Garfield ended up being assassinated by this very same guy who caught him at a train station in Washington, D.C. in July of 1881. Figured that Garfield had been ignoring him, so he decided, well, I'll shoot the guy. And he shoots him at the train station, and Garfield later died of his wounds in September of that year. And after this, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, he kind of starts dismantling the spoils system, deeming that it got to the point that someone was going to shoot just because they couldn't get a job, then we don't need to be keeping it around. So the spoils system is gone today, but during the 19th century, it was very important and it was a very common thing to see. But Jackson had been the one who had really started the whole ordeal. Now, Jackson, during his time in office, he faced a Congress that was dominated by his political enemies, the Whigs. And they were led by two very influential senators of Henry Clay of Kentucky and Daniel Webster, who I think was from Massachusetts, but I could be wrong. And these were his two biggest opponents that he would have in the office. Now, due to the factor that Congress was controlled by the Whigs and Jackson himself was a Democrat, of course, there's going to be a lot of conflict. So anything that Congress, as we know, any bill that Congress may pass has to be signed by the president. If the president does not wish to sign such a bill into law because they don't approve of it, they can veto it. And then in turn, it is returned to the Congress and must be approved. If it gets a vote and is approved by a two-thirds majority in each house, then the bill still goes into law and effect. Well, what the problem became here was that Jackson, due to the Congress being against him, they tried to pass a lot of legislation that he was not okay with because he felt it favored the wealthy elite. And Jackson, in turn, issued a lot of vetoes. In fact, to this day, if I'm not wrong, he issued more. Andrew Jackson issued more vetoes than any other president during his time in office. To this day, I think that's still a record. I think he still holds that for the most vetoes ever done by a U.S. president while in office. He vetoed more pieces of legislation than any other one has done. And one of these most famous vetoes that Jackson did, he vetoed what was called the Maysville Road legislation bill in 1830, a year after he took office in 1829. And what this piece basically was, it was sponsored by Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was a very famous senator and leader of the Whigs, the political opposition party to the Democrats at the time. And it was to provide federal funds for the construction of a road in Kentucky, which was Clay's home state, that would go from the city of Lexington to the Ohio River. Remember, this provides federal funds for a state road. Well, Jackson vetoed this bill due to his belief that he would also had on the Jackson was a man of many beliefs, and of course at the core of it was that common people need to have more say. Jackson also didn't believe in certain other things, such as this. Jackson did not believe that it was the job of the federal government to have to fund projects of a local state level or nature. He didn't believe the government should have to fund a project that is on a state level, that should be the state's problem. Which honestly, in my opinion, I gotta agree, it should be the state's problem. Basically, Jackson held that if it lacked any national connection, unless this road was going to serve a benefit for the entire country, then it should be the state's problem. The federal government shouldn't have to fund it, because the federal government should be working for all the states here, not just one. Which in this principle, I will agree with him on. And this also coincided with the view, and the Democratic view, that the Union, or the United States, was basically conceived of a cooperative aggregation of individual states. The individual states had certain things that they should be doing on their own. Now, the Whigs, they believed just the opposite, that all the states combined represented the entire nation. So if one state wanted to have federal funding, well, by God, they were going to get it. Now, Jackson held very close to his heart that there was another belief of his that he had, and this was probably one of his strongest and probably his most famous one that he had here, and that was that the banks of the country were very corrupt. They were corrupt institutions, and that they could cheat and deprive Americans of their hard-earned income. Jackson was not a very big proponent of banks. He hated them with a passion, and this sets the setting for the Bank War of 1832 that would start in 1832 between Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States. And we're going to explain what this is here, because this is probably one of the biggest events during Jacksonian democracy. Again, I'm pulling off this wonderful notebook. Jackson, when he ran for president in 1829, and then he subsequently, after becoming, 1828, he ran for president. My apologies. In 1829 and in 1830, Jackson made it very clear that he viewed the banks as horrible. He made very clear that he had both constitutional and personal objections to the bank, and this was due to his belief that the banks were placing economic power again in the hands of a wealthy elite and far from the hands of the ordinary common man. The bank, or the Second Bank, as it was commonly known here, they were the only national banking institution left in the country. They were funded by the U.S. government. They were a national bank. We do not have these in the United States today. Now, this bank had started back in 1791 when Congress had passed a charter for its creation after being urged to do so by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans opposed this at that time, and they continued to oppose the bank as the years went on. Now, the charter expired 20 years later, and it had to be renewed in order to continue the bank. Well, this first bank was not renewed, and in 1811 it shut down and was dead. There was a massive political argument between both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans over whether or not we should be funding that bank further. Now, after the War of 1812, a second bank was created of the United States. This was created in 1816, and this too was given a 20-year charter by Congress. But again, it drew heavy criticism, and especially by this time, here in the 1830s, it has drawn a lot of criticism from Andrew Jackson and his Democratic Party. Now, the second bank had been created with that 20-year charter, so that meant that the federal funding was set to expire in 1836. Now, the bank's president, whose name was Nicholas Biddle, he did gain support from mostly the Whigs in Congress, and a lot of support from Senators Clay and Webster, respectively. And he took a lot of advice from them. And in 1832, both Clay and Webster had kind of convinced Biddle that despite the fact that the expiration date of the charter was not for another 4 years, that he go ahead and ask for a renewal of the federal charter. Now, Congress, of course, was mostly controlled by the Whigs, so of course, when he applied for this, Congress overwhelmingly approved this bill, and it was sent to Andrew Jackson's desk. Well, we know that Andrew Jackson is not exactly a big supporter of the bank, and Jackson vetoes that bill in 1832, and he states the following. This is his words: "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson basically was determined to not let that bank get another charter. Jackson basically did that on his own personal beliefs. And in turn, there was also the presidential election that year in 1832, and this ended up being between Jackson, who was running for re-election, and Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, one of the main Whig leaders. Jackson did, of course, win, but during the debates of that campaign, the fate of the bank was probably one of the most heavy issues that was weighing on the public mind and was one of the most heavily debated. Now, since Jackson ended up winning re-election and he started his second term in 1833, he basically deduced that he not only had a mandate to refuse that charter, but he had to destroy the bank any way that he could, that the people wanted him to do this, because they trusted him to a second term, and he told them flat out what he wanted to do, and if they had voiced that they didn't want that, they probably wouldn't have elected him again. So Jackson starts getting this view in his head. And also to add here, Jackson probably had a little bit of personal animosity toward the bank. Some of his personal animosity toward it was probably due to the fact that a lot of his political opponents, especially the Whigs, had their deposits in that bank, they were on a payroll from it, or they had a loan from it. And he probably viewed it as it sided with his political opponents, so why should I aid you? So Jackson, he orders that no more, in 1833, Jackson ordered that no more government funds were to be deposited in the national bank. This starts the downturn that's going to lead to the bank collapsing. And because of this, all further federal deposits are no longer in the bank. However, this does not get rid of any deposits from the federal government that are already in the bank. So what happens is any existing deposits that the United States government already had in the bank, they are consumed by paying off the expenses. Jackson is committed to paying off the debt of the nation. He doesn't want the nation to be in debt anymore, and he starts trying to pay off that debt. So of course, any deposits that were already in the bank start rapidly being consumed and used up by these expenses that Jackson is using to try to pay for that debt. And any new revenues that the federal government was getting, since they could no longer deposit it into the federal bank, into the national bank due to Jackson, they instead deposit it into a roughly 89 separate smaller state banks across the nation. Due to this, Nicholas Biddle, who's president of the Second Bank of the United States, in return, he called in all the loans owed to the bank, and this in turn led to a credit shortage and an overall business downturn in the nation. Now, Henry Clay and his Whigs, they weren't too happy with this, and of course they tried to do everything they could to try to come to Biddle's aid. And in 1834, they actually passed a Senate resolution that censored Jackson for his command to no longer place federal deposits into the bank. Excuse me. Now, Jackson does not give in, even when he's censored, and eventually Biddle relaxes the credit policies of the bank, and the censure was expunged from the Senate record in 1837. Now, Biddle kept the bank operating after the charter expired in 1836, although he did not gain any support. He did not gain a charter from the federal government. Biddle was able to keep it running as he did receive a state charter from Pennsylvania, but unfortunately the bank did go bankrupt, and due to bad investment policies and to the ongoing economic crisis that occurred during the late 1830s, early 1840s, and the second bank finally shuts down in 1841. So basically, it's done. And in fact, today, if you go to Philadelphia, you can see the building where this bank was at. It's still standing. It's in a National Registered Landmark area, so it's actually kind of preserved. Now, Jackson and his government, that was basically the head of the bank war. Jackson had successfully gotten rid of the last national institution for banking in the country, and he had gotten his way there, but he didn't realize the thing that was going to have on the country, and it did kind of cause an economic downturn, but luckily for Jackson, it didn't happen until after he was out of office. It struck when his successor, who had also been his vice president, Martin Van Buren, became president in 1837, I believe. Now, Jackson and his government, another thing that they did was they continued to place tariffs on imported goods to try to bolster American companies and their products, to try to encourage their production and their sale by placing these import tariff prices on these imports coming from Europe. Well, this was highly good for the North, but in the South, this became highly resented and eventually led to the nullification crisis in 1832 as well. Now, I'm not going to go in depth about that in here because that's our other topic video one of our other topic videos this week, and I will be discussing that here separately, so I will leave that blank for now. But that involves South Carolina. Now, that's basically what goes on during Jacksonian Democracy. Now, several presidents come on during this. Jackson, he leaves office after serving 2 terms in 1837. But he had the era of Jacksonian Democracy, it really continued until roughly the early 1850s. Long after Jackson did not die until 1845. And what happens is many presidents that were come after him had been big supporters of Jackson or had been allies to him in his policies. And these are known as Jacksonian presidents. And several of the presidents, including Martin Van Buren, who succeeded Jackson, had been Jackson's vice president. He became president after him in 1837. He served only 1 term. He lost to William Henry Harrison in the election of 1840, left office in 1841. But he was a Jacksonian. James K. Polk, who was probably the most significant of these, as Andrew Jackson had the nickname of Old Hickory for his tough stance like a hickory tree. Well, James K. Polk had kind of been Jackson's protege, so to speak. He'd been his political student of most. So when Polk ran and became president, his nickname, he was so much like Jackson in his thinking that he became known as Young Hickory. Franklin Pierce, who was our 14th president, and let me get this list here. Martin Van Buren was our 8th one. James K. Polk was our 11th president from 1845 to 1849. Franklin Pierce was our 14th from 1853 to 1857. And then we even had Andrew Johnson, who was president from April of 1865 after Abraham Lincoln was shot to 1869, who had also been a big supporter of Jackson and his policies during the 1830s. Now, the bad part comes, Jacksonian democracy, it was good. It brought an age of reform. It brought a sense of democratization of politics to the common people. That common people had more of a say in their government. It had more power than they ever had before. People wanted to be part in their political future. Unfortunately, this would come to a change by the early 1850s, around 1854, because after the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of new lands in the West and the Compromise of 1850, the issue of slavery once again became reignited in the nation, and eventually, in the 1850s, it did not subside completely. In the 1850s, it became such a problem that Jacksonian democracy started to die out. And then the Civil War breaks out in 1861, and this lasts till 1865, and basically by the end of the Civil War, Jacksonian democracy is finally dead. It's over. So it lasted roughly until slavery became the dominant issue again. So roughly maybe around 20, 25 years, maybe 15. But it was a great era for America as it really brought democracy as a whole to the nation fully. So it was good on that regard, in that respect. So that is basically the principle of and reforms of the Jacksonian democracy era. I know it's not exactly the most exciting topic, but I felt it was something that needed to be addressed due to the factor that we talked about the Indian removal. I planned on doing the nullification crisis, and then I just kind of decided, why not just hit the politics of the time as well to understand what was going on. So, and it's kind of important to American history. It really brought democracy here in strength. So, that is the basics on Jacksonian democracy. All thanks to this wonderful man. Which, love him or hate him, in decent terms, he wasn't absolutely a bad president, but he had some shady stuff, and we're actually going to discuss that later this week. I kind of concluded I'm going to do something on that. So, for this later this week, I originally planned on only doing 2 more videos this week, but I'm actually going to do a very, very brief 4th one tomorrow. This is not a full-length one. This is not with the notebook or nothing. This is just to express a personal opinion that I've kind of got today over a certain issue that has happened in relation to the Titanic, which I feel I need to address my opinion as it, in my person, if after hearing the news of what happened, it kind of ticked me off a little bit, and I just feel I want to get my opinion out there. You love it or hate it. You don't have to love it, but I want to get my opinion out there. But I want to do that briefly tomorrow. I'll mention what that is. So if you are wondering what the issue is prior to looking at the video, just look up the Titanic wreck right now, and you'll see that we have a salvage little thing that's going on. Yeah, it's love it or hate it. It just depends on your stance with the wreck anyway. But I'm going to do a very brief one on that tomorrow afternoon. And for later this week, we're going to do the South Carolina nullification crisis during 1832, which basically, I kind of explain what that is. South Carolina tried to defy a federal law, which kind of is a prelude to what's going to happen about 30 years down the road, although over a much different issue. And then to kind of close off the era of Jackson in the 1830s, to kind of seal off the dome on this little chapter here that we've done, I will have a video I will do on the legacy of Andrew Jackson. Basically, was he good? Was he bad? Because to this day there is some debate over should we revere him for what he was, or should we kind of take another look at this guy, because there was some shady stuff that he did, because he was a big supporter of slavery, and his removal of the Indians may or may not have been unconstitutional. And there was some stuff that he did that wasn't good. And as mentioned, like when he got rid of the bank, it was a good idea, but it did kind of have an economic downside, but it hit after he left office. So we will discuss that later this week in a separate video. So what we're going to do, small little opinion video tomorrow, very small, love it or hate it. We will have one on the South Carolina nullification crisis of 1832, and then finally we will have one on the legacy of whether Andrew Jackson should be revered or should he be kind of reevaluated. So that is that. So that kind of ends it for all this video. Next week, I don't know what the plans are yet for next week's video, so I'm open to any ideas that anyone may have. So if you have one, be sure to get it to me. So that's all I got now. So hopefully everyone stays safe through this virus pandemic. I know a lot of states are starting to reopen, including my own. In fact, today one of our I live here in Ohio, our stay safe at home order, he actually, our wonderful, and I say that kind of with quotation marks because I know some people may not exactly always approve of him. So don't, just because I say wonderful doesn't mean I mean that truly, or doesn't mean I say that badly. But Governor Mike DeWine here in Ohio, he kind of lifted our stay safe at home Ohio order because he kind of deemed that we're at a stage now, and he's kind of displayed it as recommendations. So we're going to have to see how this goes. Hopefully this doesn't go badly. Hopefully, I mean, I do expect that we're going to have spiking cases here because we're reopening, but I would think that either way, no matter what we do, that's going to happen. So that shouldn't be enough to shut down the states, but in my opinion, it should be enough just to take it slow, take it a little easy. But we just need to watch this, and we're starting to come not to the light at the end of the tunnel, but I would say we're getting to around the halfway point. And we're just gonna have to live with this and get used to how life's gonna be here for a little while until this is over. But hopefully everyone's staying safe and doing well. So that's all I got to say. So as usual, like, subscribe to the channel, to the video, like the video. Get me any ideas that you may have if you have any, and hopefully we'll all see you back here later this week well, actually tomorrow, for the future videos that are to come. Have a good night, and God bless you.